They called themselves the Seekers, but that was just the polite term. Among the fleets of the Hratak Empire, they were scavengers, cosmic vultures hunting for derelict ships, abandoned stations, and worlds no one claimed anymore. Their flagship, the Voral 7, had been cruising the black for months when the distress beacon came through. It was faint, corrupted, almost buried under centuries of static, but the translation came back in something unsettling: human tongue. No one on the bridge knew much about humanity. They were a forgotten footnote in the archives, one of those minor species that had burned too bright and then vanished into their own extinction. The official record said they'd collapsed after a chain of internal wars, their homeworld a radioactive shell. That had been over 400 years ago. Humanity was gone. So, naturally, the Hratak captain wanted to see what they could pick off the bones. The planet they found didn't look like much: ash-gray skies, oceans the color of lead, jagged mountains cutting through thick clouds. No orbital defense satellites, no active energy grids. Dead, by all appearances. Except, there were structures. Vast, blocky constructs made from blackened alloy, half buried in the soil like the planet had tried to swallow them. The scanners picked up faint power signatures deep underground. And there was movement. That's what made Captain Draxon smile. Movement meant survivors. Survivors meant salvage, and if they were human, they'd be desperate, weak, easy to trade or take. When the landing team deployed, the air was heavy, carrying a metallic tang that clung to the back of the throat. Lieutenant Karath led the first squad through a shattered gate that must have once guarded the settlement. It was huge, the walls towering over them, but pitted and scarred, as if some enormous weapon had raked across them again and again. Inside, the streets were eerily clean. No trash, no decay, no scattered relics of the past, just bare stone walkways between the looming, silent buildings. Karath's visor flickered, momentarily static-filled. "Interference," the ship's comm officer said. "Local EM field is unstable. Keep moving." They did. The first sign that something was wrong came when one of the rear scouts, Vor, vanished from the squad's biometrics. No scream, no gunfire. Just gone. They found him seconds later, slumped against a wall. His helmet was shattered from the inside. His eyes were missing. None of the aliens said a word. They just tightened formation and kept their weapons ready. The next corner they turned revealed a man. A human. He stood barefoot on the stone, his skin pale as frost, his clothes nothing more than rough hides and scraps of armor. His hair was long, tangled, and his eyes were wrong. Too sharp, too steady, like a predator's. He didn't speak, didn't move. Just watched them. Karath raised his translator. "We are the Hratak Empire. We come in peace." The man tilted his head slightly, almost like he was studying prey. Then he spoke, his voice low, gravelly. "You shouldn't have come here." The words were in perfect Hratak. A ripple of unease went through the squad. Karath tried again. "We detected a distress signal. It wasn't for you," the man said. "It wasn't for anyone." And then the air shifted. The shadows in the street moved, not from the wind, not from the sun, but like something living had slid out from the walls themselves. Shapes emerged, hunched and broad, moving on all fours before rising to stand. Men and women, all human, but armed with weapons that looked handmade and yet lethally efficient. They surrounded the squad in seconds. Karath raised his rifle, but the pale man in front of them didn't flinch. "You think we're survivors," he said. "We're not. We're what's left after the survivors died." Somewhere far above, the Voral 7's comms officer tried to warn them. But the message was nothing but static, swallowed by the same interference that had been creeping into their gear since they landed. The last thing Kareth saw before the humans moved was the faintest smile on the pale man's face. The first one moved too fast. Kareth's rifle wasn't even halfway to his shoulder before a blur of pale muscle and raw aggression slammed into the front rank. The alien trooper, Tresh, was a full head taller than his attacker, with armor plating thick enough to shrug off a small-caliber round. But it didn't matter. The human hit like a gravity surge. There was a sound like dry twigs snapping, and Tresh dropped in a heap. Kareth barked an order, but the moment his voice hit the air, the street erupted. The humans didn't charge in the sloppy, desperate way of starving survivors. They moved in coordinated arcs, each one covering the other's flank, weapons raised and ready. The rifles they carried were a strange hybrid. Slender barrels built into bone-like stocks, magazines made from what looked like scavenged alien parts, and blades jutting from the undersides like bayonets forged in someone's nightmare. The pale man in front, the one who had spoken, didn't rush in like the rest. He stood back, watching, as if gauging how long it would take his people to dismantle the squad. Kareth fired first. The plasma bolt took one of the advancing humans in the chest, sending him spinning back into a wall. He didn't get up. But the rest didn't even flinch. 3 of them closed in from the left. Kareth's second-in-command, Vorak, swung his repeater around, unleashing a hail of bolts that should have shredded anything with a pulse. The first human in that group took 2 rounds to the shoulder, spun, and kept coming. The second dropped low, sliding across the dust before coming up inside Vorak's guard. A jagged blade slid between the plates of his armor and into his gut. The alien roared, swinging a clawed hand at the attacker, but the human yanked the blade free, pivoted, and hamstrung him in one clean move. Vorak went down hard, dragging a smear of dark, oily blood into the street. Kareth's comms buzzed in his ear, garbled, full of static. He caught only fragments. Pull back. Interference. Not alone. Not alone. That was when the sound started. It came from the walls themselves, a low, throbbing hum, deep enough that Kareth could feel it in his bones. At first he thought it was some kind of local machinery or a warning siren. Then it shifted. The pitch climbed, bending upward into a tone that was almost like a voice, but too layered, too alien to be words. The humans reacted instantly, their formation breaking as they moved to cover side streets and alleyways. They weren't scattering. They were preparing. Something was coming. Kareth backed toward the gate, firing in controlled bursts. His visor was flickering again, the HUD cutting in and out until it was little more than a haze of static. He caught glimpses of movement in the peripheral, shapes clinging to walls, dropping from rooftops, crawling on all fours before springing upright. Not all of them were human. The first one that stepped into the open was almost twice the height of a man, its body an ugly collage of flesh and metal. Its left arm ended in a crude cannon, the barrel glowing faintly with heat. Its head was covered by a visor made from what looked like the front half of a Hratak scout helmet, fused directly into bone. The thing's skin was patchy, stretched tight over mechanical implants that pulsed with blue light. It looked at Kareth and hissed. And then all hell broke loose. The augmented thing opened fire, the cannon roaring with a thunderous concussive blast. One of Kareth's soldiers took the shot full in the chest, his torso vaporizing into a spray of molten armor and cooked flesh. The others returned fire, but the thing didn't dodge. It advanced through the barrage, each step slow and deliberate. The humans moved in its wake, picking off stragglers, cutting down anyone who lagged behind. Kareth realized too late that they weren't trying to kill him outright. They were herding the squad. He caught sight of the pale man again, now walking slowly toward him through the chaos. His eyes never left Kareth. "You came here thinking we were weak," the man said, his voice somehow cutting through the noise. "That's what your kind always thinks. But weakness dies here." Karath's rifle clicked empty. He dropped it, pulling the shorter sidearm from his hip. "What are you?" he demanded, firing 2 quick shots. The pale man tilted his head slightly. One shot grazed his cheek. The other went wide. "What's left?" the man said simply. Before Karath could answer, something hit him from behind. A shockwave that sent him sprawling forward into the dust. His armor took most of it, but the impact rattled his vision. By the time he rolled over, 3 humans were on him. One pinned his left arm, another tore the sidearm from his grip, and the third pressed a blade to the gap between his helmet and chest plate. The pale man crouched in front of him now, resting his elbows casually on his knees. "Your captain's still in orbit," he said. "Tell him to leave." Karath didn't answer. He could feel his jaw tightening, the sting of humiliation burning hotter than fear. The man's eyes narrowed. If he doesn't, what happens next will not be his war. It will be his erasure. One of the humans behind Karath leaned in, whispering something in their guttural tongue. The pale man smiled faintly, then stood. "Take him below." Karath barely had time to process the order before they dragged him to his feet and hauled him toward one of the larger structures. Its entrance was a yawning black archway that seemed to breathe cold air into the street. Inside, the light vanished completely, replaced by the glow of dim, shifting lines carved into the walls. They moved fast, down corridors that twisted and narrowed until Karath lost all sense of direction. The air grew colder, the metallic tang sharper. Somewhere deep within the structure, the humming sound grew louder again. Finally, they stopped. The humans shoved him forward into a chamber so vast that his helmet's sensors failed to map its edges. The floor was smooth stone, but the walls were alive. Not moving in the way flesh moves, but pulsing, like something deep inside them was beating, slow and steady. Embedded in that pulsing mass were machines, Hratak machines, old ones, damaged beyond repair, fused into the organic wall as if the structure had eaten them. Karath stared at one familiar shape, a wrecked helmet, still bearing the insignia of the Imperial Scout Corps. The sight chilled him more than the cold air. That helmet was from a model phased out over 2 centuries ago. The pale man stepped into the chamber, his voice echoing faintly. 400 years ago, your kind came here. We weren't ready then. You took from us. You killed our weak. You left thinking we'd fade into the dirt." He stepped closer, his eyes catching the dim light. "You were wrong." Karath felt the blood pound in his ears. "You can't be the same people. That was generations ago," the man interrupted. "But we kept their stories. We learned your technology from what you left behind. We rebuilt it, improved it, and when there was nothing left to learn, we changed ourselves." Karath's gaze shifted to the wall again. The humming was no longer background. It was coming from the very surface. And now he saw it. Faces, half-formed, half-swallowed into the pulsing mass, eyes closed as if sleeping. He took an involuntary step back. "What is that?" The pale man didn't answer immediately. He walked to the nearest wall, placed a hand against it, and closed his eyes. The pulsing slowed, as if listening to him. "It's the heart of the colony," he said finally, "and the graveyard of everything that's ever tried to take it." Karath's comms crackled suddenly. Clear, sharp. "Lieutenant, this is the Voral 7. What the hell is going on down there? We're detecting massive energy spikes." The pale man glanced at him. "Tell them to leave." Karath hesitated. He was a soldier of the Empire. He didn't give in to threats from primitives, but something in the man's gaze, cold, patient, utterly confident, made his gut twist. He opened his channel. "Captain." The comms cut out again, replaced by that layered, alien hum. Only this time, Kareth realized it wasn't coming from the walls anymore. It was coming from inside his helmet. He ripped the helmet off, breathing hard. The pale man's smile deepened, but there was no triumph in it, only inevitability. "You're already part of it," the man said softly. "Every breath you've taken since you landed here, it's in you now." Kareth's heart was hammering. "What have you done?" The pale man turned away, walking toward the far side of the chamber. "I told you," he said without looking back. "You shouldn't have come here." Then the walls began to open. The walls didn't just open, they peeled. Stone split like flesh under a scalpel, layers sliding apart in smooth, deliberate motion. Beneath the outer skin of dark rock was something wet and glistening, streaked with fine metal veins that pulsed with that same low, rhythmic hum. Kareth stumbled backward, his boots scraping on the slick floor. The smell hit next, thick, metallic, and wrong. It wasn't decay exactly. It was sharper, cleaner, like breathing in the fumes from a weapons forge. From within the wall, shapes began to emerge. At first they were indistinct, their outlines blurred by the pulsing material around them. Then the mass receded further, and Kareth realized they weren't just shapes. They were bodies, Hratak bodies. The armor was old, older than anything currently in the fleet, its plating warped and corroded from centuries of exposure to whatever this thing was. The soldiers inside weren't decomposed in the way Kareth expected. Their skin was pale, stretched tight over their bones, but their eyes were open, and they were breathing. Kareth froze. The pale man glanced at him over his shoulder, reading the shock on his face. "They're not dead, not entirely." One of the half-entombed Hratak soldiers shifted, its chest rising in a slow, deliberate inhale. The sound that followed was a rasp, the dragging of air through a throat unused for centuries. "They tried to take what was ours," the pale man said. "The walls remembered them." Kareth's voice was low, almost to himself. "What is this place?" The pale man's gaze drifted up toward the chamber's unseen ceiling. "It's a prison, a teacher, a graveyard. We don't have one word for it." The humming intensified, the pitch climbing until it resonated in Kareth's teeth. He clamped his jaw, but the vibration only grew stronger, seeping into his skull. Then the walls released their captives. The first Hratak soldier stepped forward stiffly, its joints creaking like old machinery. Its visor was gone, revealing eyes clouded with a faint, unnatural glow. It didn't lunge at Kareth. Instead, it stopped beside the pale man and stood at attention. More followed, not just Hratak, but others. Armored forms from a dozen species Kareth had only seen in the Empire's history archives, all breathing, all awake, and all silent. The pale man stepped toward Kareth. "Do you know why your empire doesn't remember us?" Kareth didn't answer. He couldn't take his eyes off the soldiers. "It's because no one leaves," the pale man said, his voice almost gentle. "When your kind came before, we didn't have the strength to meet you in the open. But we learned. We adapted. We turned the dead into weapons, the living into lessons. And when we were ready..." His smile was thin, humorless. "We stopped dying." Kareth's chest tightened. "This isn't possible." The pale man shrugged. 400 years gives you time to make the impossible into habit." Kareth's comms buzzed again. A burst of static, then the captain's voice breaking through. "Lieutenant, energy readings are spiking all over the surface. We're detecting movement toward the landing site. Are you—" The voice cut off abruptly, replaced by a scream of feedback so loud Kareth yanked the comm unit from his belt. The pale man didn't move, didn't react. He'd expected it. The hum shifted again, and now Kareth recognized it for what it was. A signal. Not to him. To the things in the walls. They began to march. It wasn't a chaotic rush. It was disciplined, mechanical, each soldier stepping forward in perfect sync. They moved past Karath without so much as a glance, their boots ringing against the stone floor. "Where are they going?" Karath asked before he could stop himself. The pale man didn't break eye contact. "To finish what you started 4 centuries ago." The march through the underground tunnels was endless. Kareth was forced along with them, 2 armed humans at his back, their makeshift rifles angled low but ready. He didn't try to run, not with the pale man always just ahead. Not with the impossible procession of resurrected soldiers flanking him like a moving wall. The tunnels sloped upward, and eventually a dim light began to filter in from ahead. Karath's eyes adjusted slowly, and when they emerged, the sudden expanse of the open sky felt almost alien after so long in the stone belly of the colony. They weren't in the settlement anymore. They stood on the edge of a vast plain of jagged rock and black sand. At the far end, the Voral 7's landing site lay in ruins. The shuttlecrafts were wrecks, their hulls torn open like paper, smoke curling lazily into the gray sky. The captain's voice crackled faintly from somewhere in the wreckage, shouting orders to retreat, but it was already too late. The soldiers from the walls fanned out, their movements unnervingly precise. They advanced without firing a shot, their presence alone enough to send the few surviving Hratak scrambling backward toward the hills. Karath's breath caught when he saw the augmented giants from earlier, the hulking hybrids of flesh and machine. They strode among the soldiers like shepherds among their flock, their glowing eyes scanning the battlefield. The pale man walked to the front of the formation and raised his hand. That was the signal. The first shot came from one of the resurrected Hratak, a clean, single bolt that punched through the chest of a fleeing alien. He fell instantly, then the rest joined in, and the air turned into a storm of plasma and metal. Karath couldn't look away. These soldiers didn't fight like the undisciplined scavengers he'd expected. They moved like an army, not a desperate militia, but a force trained for war, each unit slotting seamlessly into the other's movements. And the humans, the living ones, were even worse. They were faster than any soldier should be, using cover in ways Kareth's tactical mind struggled to follow. They fought like predators, never staying in the open long enough to be targeted, striking with brutal precision before melting back into the chaos. In minutes, the Hratak landing site was nothing but corpses and fire. The pale man turned, scanning the wreckage before walking back toward Kareth. His boots left no sound on the black sand. "You understand now," he said. Karath's voice was hoarse. "You can't win against the Empire." The man studied him for a long moment, then tilted his head slightly. "The Empire doesn't know we exist, not yet." Kareth frowned. "Then why attack us?" The pale man's eyes narrowed. "Because you came here." He stepped closer, his voice dropping until only Karath could hear it. "If your captain escapes, the Empire comes next. But if he dies here, the story ends on this rock. You and I both know which future is cleaner." Kareth said nothing. The pale man turned away, raising his hand again. A distant rumble rolled across the plain. Kareth looked towards the source and felt his stomach drop. The Voral 7 was falling. It didn't explode in the sky. It didn't burn in re-entry. It simply descended, slow and controlled, until it hit the ground with a sound like mountains breaking. The hull split in half, and from the wreckage, figures began to emerge. Not the crew Karath expected, but more of the Pale Man's soldiers. He realized with sick clarity that they'd never been in orbit at all. The captain, the bridge crew, they'd been taken the moment they arrived. The voice on his comm earlier, it hadn't been real. It had been bait. The Pale Man walked past him without looking back. Come, there's one last thing you need to see before you join them. Karath didn't resist when they marched him away from the wreckage of the Voral 7. There was no point. The Pale Man's army moved like clockwork around him. Not a wasted step, not a single soldier breaking formation. This wasn't the chaos of raiders or scavengers. It was a machine wearing human faces. They led him toward a jagged ridge at the far end of the black plain. The ground here was cracked and uneven, littered with the skeletal remains of long-dead machinery. Massive engine housings lay half-buried in the sand, their surfaces pitted with age, and something that looked disturbingly like teeth marks. Karath's boots crunched on the gravel as they descended into a wide crevice in the rock. The air grew warmer, damp, carrying a faint tang of ozone and something organic beneath it. There was no sunlight here. The only illumination came from thin strands of faintly glowing filament embedded in the walls, pulsing in time with that same low, bone-deep hum he'd felt in the chamber earlier. The tunnel widened, and suddenly the ceiling opened into a vast underground cavern. Karath stopped short. It was a city, not the ruined husks above ground, but something alive, thriving. Towers of black alloy and bone rose from the cavern floor, their surfaces crawling with lights that moved like rivers. Bridges of woven metal and sinew connected the structures, their shapes curved and asymmetrical, more like the inside of a living creature than any architectural design he'd seen. And everywhere, there were people. Humans, yes, but not like the ones he'd fought earlier. Some moved with smooth, predatory grace, their eyes tracking him with the calm interest of an apex predator watching from the tall grass. Others were clearly altered, limbs replaced with sleek mechanical constructs or fused seamlessly with alien weaponry. One man walked past on legs that bent backward like a raptor's, his gait unnervingly silent despite the weight of the plasma cannon fused to his spine. And then there were the ones that weren't entirely human anymore. Their skin was mottled with patches of dark, chitin-like armor that moved when they breathed. Their eyes glowed faintly, and their voices, the few words he caught, carried a layered, almost harmonic tone, as if more than one throat were speaking at once. No one looked starved. No one looked desperate. They were strong. They were ready. The Pale Man finally stopped at the base of one of the larger towers. Its surface was smooth and wet-looking, with veins of dull metal running down its sides. The entrance was a simple arch, its edges rippling faintly, like the lip of some enormous wound. Karath hesitated. The Pale Man didn't. He stepped through, the surface parting around him as if it were liquid. And then he was gone. One of the human guards shoved Karath forward. The moment he touched the arch, it gave way under his hands, cool and pliant like muscle. Passing through was like walking into the body of some sleeping beast. Inside, the air was warmer, thicker, and carried a low vibration that seemed to settle directly into his chest. The walls were alive, not moving in obvious ways, but subtly flexing and shifting like they were breathing. They ascended a spiral ramp, each step bringing them deeper into the tower. And then they reached it, the joining chamber. Karath knew it instinctively. The space was circular, its walls lined with dozens of deep alcoves. Inside each alcove stood a figure, human, alien, or something in between, suspended in a vertical cradle of cables and bone-like struts. Some of them were awake, their eyes following him as he passed. Others appeared unconscious, their bodies twitching slightly as filaments no thicker than a hair burrowed into their skin. He saw armor plates forming directly over muscle. He saw weapons fusing with arms. He saw mechanical implants that pulsed in time with the heartbeat visible in the neck. The pale man stood at the center of the room beside a great column of translucent material. Within it, something massive and coiled shifted lazily, its outline never fully clear, part machine, part organism. It pulsed once, and every filament in the room glowed brighter in answer. "This," the pale man said quietly, "is where the colony lives." Karath's mouth was dry. "You turn people into those things." The pale man's expression didn't change. "We free them from the weaknesses that kill civilizations. Out there." He gestured vaguely toward the surface. "You build empires that crumble. You breed soldiers that age and die. Here, we make them better, faster, stronger. We make them forever." Karath's hands curled into fists. "You enslave them." That earned the faintest hint of a smile. "No one here is a slave. We choose this. When the time comes, every one of us wants the joining. And when it's done, we are part of something greater than a single life." He stepped closer to Karath. "You felt it already. The hum, the pull in your bones. The air you've been breathing since you landed carries the seed of it. It's why you feel heavier, stronger, why your heart beats not your own anymore." Karath's stomach turned cold. "You infected me." The pale man's eyes were steady. "We invited you." Behind him, one of the suspended figures shifted, a hratak, its armor already fused to its skin, the plates flexing as it breathed. Its eyes opened slowly, and for the first time, Karath saw what lived behind them. There was no fear there, no defiance, just acceptance. "They were like you once," the pale man said softly. "Now they're more." Karath forced his voice steady. "Why show me this? Why not just kill me?" The pale man's gaze hardened. "Because you're going to make a choice. You can return to your empire and lie, tell them the colony was empty, that the surface was uninhabitable, that you lost your squad to a storm. You can live whatever life the empire allows you after this failure. Or—" He gestured to the great column, where the massive, coiled shape shifted again, pressing faintly against the translucent wall. The sound it made was not a hum now. It was a whisper, faint but layered, too deep to understand but impossible to ignore. "You can join us, and never be weak again." Karath didn't answer. He could feel the hum in his bones growing stronger by the second. His pulse sinking with its rhythm despite himself. The thought of fighting it, of resisting, felt like pushing against the tide of a black ocean. Somewhere in the back of his mind, the soldier in him still screamed empire, still clung to loyalty, to chain of command. But another part, the primal part, felt the weight of the pale man's words, felt the truth in them. No hunger, no aging, no fear of death, just power. The pale man seemed to read that hesitation. "You've seen your empire's wars. You know how they waste their soldiers. You know how they leave them to die for scraps of territory. Here, there's no waste. No one is left behind. We carry every life forward." Karath's jaw tightened. "And if I say no?" The pale man stepped back, his face unreadable. "Then you'll still join us. It just won't be your choice." At a signal from him, two altered humans stepped forward, their hands gripping Karath's arms like iron bands. He didn't struggle, not because he couldn't, but because deep down he already knew the outcome. They led him toward one of the empty alcoves. The cradle opened like the ribs of some great beast, and the filaments inside twitched eagerly. The pale man stopped just beside him. "You have until the cradle closes to decide whether this is a gift or a punishment." Kareth stared into the alcove. The hum was louder here, vibrating through his teeth, his bones, the very air in his lungs. It was almost a voice now, just on the edge of words. And it was calling his name. The cradle waited like an open mouth. Filaments coiled and uncoiled lazily, tasting the air. They glistened in the dim, pulsing light, each strand tipped with a hooked end that quivered whenever Kareth moved. The two altered guards tightened their grip on his arms, their fingers digging in hard enough to make his armor creak. The pale man stood just off to the side, hands clasped behind his back. He didn't need to order them forward. Everything in the room, the hum, the walls, the strange coiled shape in the translucent column, was already pushing Kareth toward the cradle. "You've seen what happens to those who refuse," the pale man said quietly. "You've seen their faces in the walls, but you've also seen what they become when they accept. No more weakness, no more fear." Kareth's mouth was dry. "And no more self." The pale man's gaze didn't waver. "A self is only worth keeping if it serves something greater. Your empire tells you that. The difference is, we mean it." The guards shoved him a step closer. The cradle's filaments stirred, reaching toward him like the legs of some hungry insect. The hum inside his skull grew louder, syncing perfectly with his heartbeat until it felt like his chest was no longer his own. And then, without warning, the hum spiked. It wasn't the slow, insistent pull he'd been feeling since he landed. This was a shock wave, a blast of soundless pressure that rattled his bones and filled his vision with white. The two guards faltered, their grips loosening for the briefest instant. Kareth didn't think. He moved. He tore his right arm free, driving his elbow backward into the first guard's jaw. Something cracked. The man stumbled, and Kareth twisted, ripping himself out of the second guard's grasp. The pale man didn't shout an order. He simply tilted his head slightly, as if watching a piece of theater he'd seen before. The guards recovered quickly. Too quickly. Their movements weren't natural. They were too smooth, too coordinated. The first lunged low, aiming to wrap Kareth's legs, while the second came high, reaching for his throat. Kareth sidestepped the low tackle, driving a knee into the second guard's gut hard enough to make him stagger. In the same motion, he yanked the short blade from the dead guard's belt. Crude, blackened steel with a serrated edge, and buried it under the first guard's arm where armor met flesh. Hot blood sprayed across the cradle's frame. The guard didn't scream. He just sagged to the floor, his eyes still locked on Kareth as if waiting for permission to fall. The pale man's voice was calm. "You can kill as many as you like. The joining will still take you." Kareth didn't answer. He was already moving, sprinting towards the spiral ramp they'd taken into the chamber. The remaining guard lunged after him, but Kareth caught the man's wrist mid-grab, twisted hard until something snapped, and shoved him into the cradle. The filaments reacted instantly. They surged forward, wrapping the guard's limbs and throat, pulling him inside. The cradle's frame slammed shut, and the man's muffled, wordless sounds were drowned in the rising hum. Kareth didn't look back. The ramp wound downward, deeper than he remembered. His boots pounded against the slick floor, the hum following him like a shadow. It wasn't fading. If anything, it was chasing him, its pitch shifting, becoming sharper, almost angry. He burst into a lower corridor and skidded to a stop. The way out was gone. The passage he'd come through earlier was sealed, the walls grown over with the same living material he'd seen above. It pulsed faintly, the light in its veins dimming and brightening like a slow heartbeat. Footsteps echoed behind him. Slow, measured. He turned. The pale man was there, standing at the top of the ramp, flanked by a half-dozen altered humans. None of them carried rifles. They didn't need them. "You think you're running," the pale man said, "but this place is alive, Kareth. It knows where you are. It knows what you are. You can't hide from something that already has you in its blood." Kareth's grip tightened on the stolen blade. "Then it'll have to earn me." The pale man's lips curved faintly. "Good." The altered humans surged forward. Kareth fought like a cornered animal. He dropped the first with a slash to the throat, spun to catch the second across the knee, then drove his shoulder into the third's gut hard enough to hear ribs crack. But they didn't go down like soldiers in the field. Even wounded, they kept coming, their eyes locked on him with cold, inhuman focus. He backed into the sealed wall, swinging the blade in short, brutal arcs. His armor was scored with cuts, his breathing ragged. Blood, his and theirs, smeared the floor. Then the pale man stepped forward. The others stopped instantly, forming a loose circle around them. Kareth raised the blade, his stance low. The pale man didn't draw a weapon. "One last chance," he said softly. "Walk into the cradle on your own. I will make it quick. You will not feel pain. Fight any longer, and it will hurt." Kareth spat blood onto the floor. "If you want me, you'll have to take me." The pale man's eyes hardened. "So be it!" He moved faster than Kareth expected. One moment he was standing still, the next he was inside Kareth's guard, his palm slamming into the alien's chest hard enough to send him sprawling. The impact rattled Kareth's ribs, knocking the air from his lungs. Before he could rise, the pale man was on him, a knee pressing into his sternum, one hand pinning his blade arm to the floor. The other reached for his helmet. Kareth twisted violently, slamming the side of his head into the man's jaw. The pale man grunted but didn't loosen his grip. His fingers hooked under the helmet's edge and tore it free. The hum roared in Kareth's unprotected ears now, deafening, filling every thought. He felt it in his teeth, his bones, the very rhythm of his heart. His vision blurred, and for a split second he saw everything. The walls above ground, the towers in the underground city, the faces in the prison flesh, the vast, coiled shape in the translucent column. They were all the same thing. One mind, one body, one will, and it wanted him. Kareth bared his teeth and drove his forehead into the pale man's nose. The crack was sharp and satisfying. The man reeled back, and Kareth rolled, grabbing his blade and coming up in a crouch. The circle of altered humans tightened. Kareth lunged at the nearest, burying the blade in the man's throat, then ripping it free and spinning toward the next. He didn't think about winning. There was no winning here, only taking as many of them down as he could before the hum swallowed him whole. A hand clamped on his shoulder. The pale man was there again, his face smeared with blood from the broken nose, his eyes burning with cold fury. "Enough," he growled. The hum spiked. Kareth's muscles locked. His grip on the blade faltered. The pale man stepped closer. And Kareth realized the sound wasn't just in his head anymore. It was coming from the man himself. The last thing Kareth saw before darkness slammed into him was the pale man's lips moving. He couldn't hear the words over the hum, but he understood them. "You're ours now." Darkness didn't come like the flick of a switch. It came in waves. First, there was the weight, a crushing liquid heaviness that pulled him downward into himself, like sinking in black water. Then the hum was gone, replaced by the sound of his own heartbeat, except it wasn't his. It was slower, stronger, older. Kareth opened his eyes and found nothing but gray. No floor, no ceiling, no horizon, just a shifting fog that thickened when he tried to move and thinned when he stood still. His armor was gone. His weapons were gone. His hands looked bare and wrong. The fingers were longer. The nails were dark, curved, harder than they should be. He flexed them, and the fog rippled outward like a disturbed pond. "Karath!" The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, deep, layered, carrying the weight of hundreds of voices stacked atop each other. He turned in a slow circle. "Show yourself." The fog parted, and something stepped forward. It was him. Not exactly. The figure had his height, his build, even the same scars, but its eyes were pitch black from corner to corner, and its skin shimmered faintly as if thin metal moved just beneath the surface. It didn't blink. "You've been fighting since the moment you landed," the double said, "but you know how this ends." Karath set his jaw. "I'm not yours." The thing smiled without warmth. "You already are. You breathed our air. You walked our streets. The seed is inside you. The only choice you have left is how you join." The fog churned, and from it, shapes began to form. The pale man, the altered soldiers, the faces in the walls. They surrounded him, silent and waiting. The double stepped closer. "You've served an empire that sent you to die for scraps of power. We don't waste what's ours. We carry it forward. You could be more than a soldier who bleeds out on some nameless rock." Karath's hands curled into fists. "I'd rather die." The double tilted its head. "You think this is death?" The ground, if there even was ground, cracked beneath his feet. The fog thinned further, and suddenly he was falling. He landed hard on something wet. The air here was thick, humid, and stank of blood and ozone. He pushed himself up and realized he was lying on the inside of a massive, pulsating chamber. The walls were slick, alive, and covered in hundreds of narrow, vein-like tubes that writhed slowly. Figures hung from the ceiling by those tubes, soldiers from a dozen species, suspended like meat on hooks. Some twitched weakly, others hung limp, and a few were clearly screaming, though no sound left their mouths. Karath staggered to his feet, his bare soles slipping on the slick floor. The hum returned, deeper than ever, vibrating through the chamber until his teeth ached. The pale man's voice came from behind him. "This is where the joining begins." Karath turned, and wished he hadn't. The pale man was no longer human, or rather the human part of him was only the core, wrapped in a lattice of dark, bone-like armor that shifted as he moved. Filaments sprouted from his spine, twitching like the feelers of some deep-sea predator. His eyes glowed faintly, but not with light. It was something else, something that felt like it could see through him. "This is not pain," the pale man said, stepping closer. "This is rebirth." The walls rippled, and a section opened behind Karath like a wound tearing open. From it slid something massive, a coiled bundle of muscle, metal, and pulsing tissue, its surface slick with translucent fluid. It moved with slow, deliberate weight, like it didn't need to hurry. "This is the heart of the colony," the pale man said. "It remembers every soldier, every life we've taken in, and now it will remember you." The thing's head, if it could be called that, reared up. There was no face, only a cluster of twitching sensory stalks and a circular mouth lined with fine, needle-like teeth. Karath reached for a weapon out of instinct and found nothing. His hands were empty. His body felt heavy, his muscles sluggish. The pale man stepped aside. "You can walk to it, or it can come to you." Karath didn't move. The heart moved first. It slid toward him, the floor shifting wetly under its bulk. Filaments uncoiled from its sides, reaching for him, each one tipped with a fine, barbed point. One brushed his arm, and a burning cold shot straight to his shoulder. Karath lunged backward, but the filaments tracked him perfectly. They didn't lash or strike wildly. They moved with patience, wrapping his path in a cage of twitching lines. One darted forward, stabbing into his thigh. Pain flared white-hot, and then nothing. His leg went numb. He fell to one knee. Another filament struck, embedding itself in his shoulder. The numbness spread fast, a cold tide crawling through his veins. The pale man crouched in front of him, watching his face. "You'll fight, yes. They all do. But the fight only lasts until you see what you can be." The heart loomed over him now, its mouth opening slowly. Inside was not flesh, but light, a blinding, molten gold that pulsed in time with the hum. It was beautiful. It was horrifying. The filaments lifted him from the floor. His body hung limply between them, his head tipped back toward the light. The hum was all there was now. No thought, no fear, just the rhythm, slow and steady, endless. And then it spoke. Not in words he understood, but in memory. He saw the first humans who'd come here, desperate, starving, hunted by alien fleets. He saw them find the heart, saw them offer themselves to it, and saw what they became. He saw battles waged in the black void, alien ships torn apart by weapons grown from living flesh. He saw soldiers who never aged, who fought for centuries without rest, and he saw himself among them. The image was so vivid he almost believed it. He was stronger, faster, his armor fused to his body, his weapon an extension of his will. No orders from distant commanders, no empty promises from politicians, only the colony's will, which was his will. He felt the first thread slip into his spine. The cold vanished. The light filled him. "Join us," the pale man whispered. For a heartbeat, Karath almost said yes, but in the depths of that golden light, he saw something else, a flicker the heart hadn't meant to show him. The humans here weren't free. They moved with purpose, yes, but it wasn't their own. The will they served was not theirs, no matter how much it whispered otherwise. They were part of something greater, but they were not themselves anymore. The hum faltered for the briefest instant. Karath forced the words through clenched teeth. "I am not yours." The light flared, almost in surprise. The filaments tightened, but Karath twisted violently, yanking against the hooks in his flesh until something tore. Pain exploded down his back, real pain this time, but it cut through the hum like a blade. He fell. The pale man's expression shifted for the first time, a flicker of genuine surprise. "No one resists the heart." Karath staggered to his feet, blood running down his arms and legs. "Then maybe it's time someone did." The heart recoiled slightly, its mouth closing, the golden light dimming. The hum rose again, louder, angrier. All around the chamber, the suspended bodies began to twitch and strain against their bonds. The pale man stepped back, his voice calm again, but edged with steel. "You've made your choice. Now you'll suffer for it." The filaments lashed out. Karath ran. Karath hit the floor hard and slid across the slick, pulsing surface, his palms leaving smeared trails of his own blood. The hum was everywhere now, not just in his bones. It was in the air, vibrating against his skin like a living fog. The heart roared in response to his escape, a soundless pressure that made the walls ripple and the air taste of iron. Filaments snapped after him, slicing through the air with whip-like cracks. One grazed his cheek, leaving a cold burn that bit deep into the muscle. He didn't stop. The chamber narrowed into a tunnel, its walls flexing in slow, rhythmic contractions. He could feel them trying to slow him, gripping at his shoulders and boots like the throat of some massive predator refusing to spit him out. He yanked his arm free of one tightening fold and dove forward, landing in a shallow pool of warm, viscous fluid. The stuff clung to him, pulling at his limbs, but he forced himself up and kept moving. Somewhere behind him, the pale man's voice carried through the living corridor. Calm, unhurried. "You can run, Karath. You can even make it to the surface, but the seed is in you. No matter how far you go, you will come back." Karath ignored him. The tunnel bent sharply to the left, then dropped into a vertical shaft. Without thinking, he jumped. The fall wasn't far, but he landed badly. His knees jolting painfully. The shaft opened into a wider space, an arterial chamber crisscrossed with strands of living cable as thick as his torso. They pulsed faintly, carrying the golden light deeper into the colony's body. Figures moved along them. Altered humans and other joined soldiers clung to the strands effortlessly, crawling in insect-like bursts of speed. Their heads turned toward him in perfect unison, their eyes catching the dim light. Karath didn't wait for them to move. He sprinted for the far side of the chamber, weaving between the cables. The first joined soldier dropped from above, landing hard enough to make the floor shudder. Karath ducked under its swing and drove his shoulder into its midsection, sending it sprawling backward into a tangle of cables. The others began to close in. He found a gap between two pulsing walls and forced his way through, the opening narrowing as if trying to seal him inside. The edges scraped against his skin, leaving thin, stinging cuts. On the other side was a tunnel lined with what looked like ribbed plating. Bone, maybe, or something that had started as bone and become more. The hum was quieter here, muffled, but the air carried a faint breeze. Airflow meant an exit. He ran. The tunnel sloped upward, its ribs flexing slightly as if they resented being used for his escape. Twice, sharp protrusions slid down from the ceiling, blocking his path, but he ducked and rolled under them. The second time, one of the hooks caught the back of his thigh, tearing muscle. Pain shot up his leg, but he pushed through it, limping faster. A shadow flickered in his peripheral vision. He glanced back and saw the pale man. He wasn't running. He didn't need to. The altered soldiers flanked him, scuttling along the walls and ceiling like predators in no hurry to pounce. His eyes locked on Karath, and even across the distance, Karath felt the pull again, the pressure in his skull urging him to stop. He pushed harder. The tunnel widened into another chamber, this one ringed with vertical shafts. Warm air rushed up from below, carrying the smell of scorched metal. A distant rumble echoed from somewhere deep in the colony's belly. Karath spotted a shaft, where the light from above was faintly different, colder, sharper. Daylight. He ran for it. A joined soldier dropped in front of him, blocking the path. Its arms had been replaced with long, curved blades, their edges blackened from use. It moved with terrifying speed, slashing at his chest. Karath twisted sideways, feeling the blade slice across his ribs, and slammed his shoulder into the soldier's jaw. Bone cracked. He grabbed the creature's own blade arm and shoved it into the shaft's edge, wedging it just long enough to slip past. The shaft's interior was narrow, ribbed and slick. He began to climb, hands and feet finding purchase on the uneven surface. Above him, the light grew brighter, bluer. Below him, the pale man's voice rose again. "Even if you reach the surface, there is nowhere for you to go. The plane is ours. The sky is ours. The black above the sky is ours." Karath kept climbing. Halfway up, something grabbed his ankle. He kicked hard, feeling the grip loosen, but a second hand clamped down, dragging him down several feet. He twisted, bringing his heel up into the attacker's face. There was a wet crunch, and the hand slipped away. He didn't stop. The shaft's light grew stronger, and the air was colder now. He could smell the faint tang of the surface, dust, stone, and the thin bite of wind. His fingers broke through into open air. He hauled himself up, rolling onto rough, jagged rock. The sky above was slate gray, clouds heavy and low. The horizon was a jagged mess of black ridges, and the faint glow of fires still burning from the destruction of the Voral 7's landing site. He pushed himself to his feet, scanning for cover. The pale man had been right about one thing. The plane was crawling with movement. Joined soldiers patrolled in loose arcs, their eyes scanning for any sign of intruders. He didn't have long. Karath limped toward the nearest ridge, keeping low. Every step was a fight. His leg throbbed with each movement, and the cuts along his ribs burned in the cold air. But the wind here carried no hum. The silence was almost painful after the constant vibration inside the colony. He reached the ridge and ducked behind a jagged outcrop. From here, he could see the distant remains of the Voral 7, a broken carcass lying in a shallow crater, its hull split open like a ruptured shell. No survivors moved among the wreckage. Something shifted behind him. He turned, and the pale man stood there. He wasn't breathing hard. He wasn't even armed. The wind tugged at the loose ends of his clothing, and his black eyes were fixed on Karath with that same steady certainty. "You can't run from what's inside you," he said. Karath's grip tightened on the jagged shard of rock he'd picked up without realizing it. "Then I'll cut it out." The pale man took one slow step forward. "You can't cut out what you've already become." Karath didn't wait for him to close the distance. He swung the rock hard, aiming for the man's temple. The pale man caught it easily, his hand closing around Karath's wrist like a vice. For a moment, they were locked there, two wills pressing against each other, neither giving ground. The pale man's grip tightened, but Karath leaned into it, forcing the shard closer, closer, until it grazed the man's cheek. A thin line of dark blood welled up. The pale man's eyes narrowed. For the first time, Karath saw something in them that wasn't certainty. "You think this means you can kill me?" the pale man asked. Karath's voice was low. "No, but it means I can hurt you." He yanked his wrist free, the rock slipping from his fingers, and turned to run. The pale man didn't follow immediately. His voice carried after Karath, calm and unhurried once more. "Run, soldier. The seed will bring you home." The ridge fell away into a valley of black stone and ash, a jagged scar stretching toward the horizon. Karath descended in long, uneven strides, every muscle screaming from the cold and from the damage the colony had already done to him. The sky above was still heavy with clouds, the wind cutting like a blade across his face. No hum, no whisper. For the first time since he'd landed, the silence felt almost clean. He picked his way down a steep slope, using one hand to steady himself against the stone. The shard of rock he'd used against the pale man was gone, but he still carried the weight of that moment, the proof that they could bleed enough, and anything could die. At the base of the valley lay a broken stretch of terrain littered with the corpses of Hratak soldiers. Karath crouched beside one, prying a half-destroyed sidearm from its stiffened fingers. The charge indicator was barely in the green, but it would fire. He kept moving. The valley narrowed ahead, the stone walls climbing on either side until they became sheer cliffs. The terrain forced him into a bottleneck, and every instinct screamed trap. Halfway through, the wind shifted. The hum returned, faint at first, then growing like a storm front rolling in. It wasn't in his bones this time. It was in the air, carried on the wind itself. Karath stopped. From the shadow of the cliffs ahead, figures began to emerge, altered soldiers, their movements sharp and deliberate. Behind them came others, not joined yet, but pale, armed, and very much alive. And then the pale man stepped into view. "You've come far," he said, voice carrying easily over the wind. "Farther than anyone before you." Kareth raised the sidearm, its barrel steady despite the ache in his arms. "Close enough to finish this." The pale man glanced at the weapon, then back at him. "You could kill me, perhaps, but it wouldn't end here. This place, this life, it's bigger than me. Then I'll kill it." Something flickered in the pale man's expression, the faintest trace of amusement. "You think the heart hides? It is the colony. It is in the stone, the air, the blood in your veins. You can't kill it without killing yourself." "Maybe that's the point," Karath said. The pale man studied him for a moment longer. "Then come." The soldiers moved forward, but Karath didn't back away. He fired. The bolt took one in the head, dropping it instantly. The others broke into a sprint, their footsteps pounding against the black stone. Karath dove sideways into the jagged wall, finding a narrow crevice and forcing himself through. The stone scraped his arms and tore his uniform. But he emerged on a ledge above the bottleneck. From here, he could see the pale man and his soldiers moving below. He raised the sidearm and aimed, not at them, but at the cliff face above them. The first shot hit a weak seam, sending a thin shower of rock chips down. The second shot cracked it wider. The third brought the mountain down. The sound was like the sky breaking. Massive slabs of stone sheared free, crashing into the bottleneck with bone-shattering force. Dust and rock filled the air, the sound of impact drowning the hum for the first time. When the dust settled, the passage was gone, buried under tons of rubble. Karath didn't see the pale man's body among the wreckage, but he also didn't see him standing. It would have to be enough. The ridge beyond the valley sloped toward a dry riverbed. Karath followed it until the land opened into a wide expanse of cracked mud and scattered boulders. At the far edge, half buried in the dust, was a shuttle. Not Hratak design, older, bulkier, with human markings so faded they were almost gone. He limped toward it, hope and suspicion warring in his chest. The ramp was down, the interior dark. Inside, the controls were coated in a thin layer of grit, but they were intact. Power was low, but the systems responded to his touch. The engines coughed, then settled into a low hum. A different hum, one that didn't crawl under his skin. Karath settled into the pilot's chair, his fingers moving over the controls. The nav systems were ancient, but they still showed the stars. He could be gone in minutes. He hesitated. His reflection in the darkened console glass caught his eye. The cuts on his face had already closed, the skin smooth where there should have been scarring. His eyes. The pupils were wrong, too sharp, too focused. The seed was still in him. He gripped the control yoke, his jaw tight. He could leave now. Get to a relay station. Warn the Empire. But the seed, the colony would find him eventually. He thought of the heart, of the light, of the way it had almost pulled him in. If he left, it would spread. Karath keyed in a new course, not away from the planet, but back toward the landing site. The shuttle lifted, dust spiraling away in the downdraft. He angled it low over the plain, keeping it below the ridge lines. The wreckage of the Voral 7 came into view, still smoldering. Beyond it, the colony's surface structures loomed like jagged teeth. He didn't slow. The shuttle's alarms screamed as he pushed the throttle into the red. The ground blurred under him. The colony's towers rose to meet him. The pale man was there, standing on one of the black walls, looking up at him. Even from this distance, Karath felt the pull. Not this time. The shuttle hit the first tower at full speed. The impact ripped the hull apart, fire and shrapnel tearing into the structure. The explosion rolled through the plain, the shockwave flattening the smaller buildings. Karath's world became fire, metal, and the deafening roar of destruction. For a moment, he felt the hum spike, sharp and desperate like a wounded animal. Then it faltered. Darkness took him. He woke to silence. The air was thick with dust and smoke. The colony's towers were gone, reduced to heaps of twisted metal and blackened stone. The ground beneath him still vibrated faintly, but the hum was gone. He pushed himself up, every movement aching. His hands were burned, his uniform shredded, but he was alive. A figure moved in the smoke ahead. Tall, thin, black-eyed. The pale man. Half his body was burned away, the armor fused to melted flesh. Filaments twitched weakly from his spine. He knelt in the rubble, staring at Karath with something that might have been respect. "You killed it," he rasped. Karath's voice was raw. "Not yet, but it won't spread." The pale man's head dipped once, slow. "Then, maybe, you are one of us after all." He collapsed forward, the last of his breath leaving him in a faint, rattling sigh. Karath sat in the ruins until the sun began to break through the clouds. The seed was still in him. Maybe it always would be. But for now, the colony was dead. And if it ever came back, so would he.